All right. We are here with the late, great Anand Mehta, who is going to tell us a little something about boats today. Anand, how did you become interested in boats?
You know, it's the story that I feel like applies to a lot of members of my generation, pop culture. I was a big fan of the 1997 movie Titanic. I have to say, rather naive beginnings for such a deep field of research, such a deep part of our history. But I did become interested with boats and, to be more specific, ships, and to be even more specific, ocean liners through the movie Titanic when I found myself not caring about the main characters, but instead being fascinated by the ship itself. This, of course, coupled with a National Geographic review in 2012, which, as you know, is the 100th anniversary of the Titanic sinking, cemented my interest in not just the ship itself, but the wider industry that it grew up in.
Do you think the sinking of the Titanic was justified? In the sense that God was punishing them for flying too close to the sun?
In David Fincher's movie Seven in 1995, they mentioned the seven deadly sins. And one of them, the most devastating, of course, as you remember, was pride. And nothing can describe the executives of the White Star Line, the British Board of Trade, the British government, and J.P. Morgan himself, the head of the American conglomerate that had acquired White Star Line only a decade prior, as pride. Nothing describes them more completely and absolutely. This was God's justice, not God's punishment. You used the wrong term, Mr. Parsons. It was justice. When that liner sank, when all of the prominent members of the banking industry and all of the prominent members of the American industrial class sank with it, that was God saying, you have gone too far. That was God saying, you have crossed the line. And let's see where pride comes from. Pride comes from thinking that you know more than God. That thinking that you could overcome God's kingdom. They claimed that Titanic was unsinkable. Of course, not the White Star Line itself in any official press, but the executives certainly peddled that story when the newspapers ran it.
Oh, and I know the fact that they marketed it as unsinkable was one of the ways that they could justify the suspicious lack of adequate numbers of life preservers in boats and provisions like that.
Let's think about another deadly sin, sloth. They got rid of the lifeboats in order to make more deck space for lounge chairs. First-class lounge chairs, rather than lifeboats, they installed these new type davits that could take an extra row of boats inside the first one in order to meet capacity. They were never used. This innovation was only used on Titanic's sister ship, the HMHS Britannic. And I say HMHS because it was Her Majesty's hospital ship, because she only ever served in World War I and sank. And so the HMHS Britannic, of course, had only 32 deaths when it was carrying a similar capacity to that of the Titanic because they had implemented this new regulation after the Titanic had sank. So I would say that this pride was certainly a key factor, as you said. They were already taking ticket orders for return voyages from New York to Liverpool or New York to Southampton before the Titanic had even set sail on her maiden voyage. That's how
Captain
confident
Smith,
they were.
he goes down with the ship. How do you interpret that symbolism?
It's a deep tragedy for Captain Smith. A little known fact about the voyage was the fact that it was meant to be his last before retirement. This is something that not a lot of people know, but he had been with the White Star Line for 3 decades prior. In fact, he was one of their flagship captains. He not only captained the RMS Olympic, which was Titanic's sister ship, and was in fact, before the sinking, the more famous ship being the first in the trio, but had captained numerous other vessels, including the Teutonic, which had ignited the imagination of Kaiser Wilhelm II to such a degree that he invested heavily into Germany's ocean liner development in the 1890s. But I digress. Captain Smith's going down with a ship is one of the few instances in which pride did not take over. Because Captain Smith was at the peak of his career, literally before retirement, and he decided to maintain the tradition. He decided to hold himself to that higher standard of a captain going down with his ship, of accepting the fault, of accepting the fallibility, and locking himself in the wheelhouse just moments.
So it was about honor then. It was about doing the job in good faith.
They say he encapsulated the British stiff upper lip, is what they called it, which is a very loyal maintenance of honor. You're right. And, as you know, the sea forms bonds, traditions, and honor codes like no other force in nature. And it's during these struggles, during these crises, that these traditions are made over the course of hundreds of years. With the weight of that on your shoulders, as someone who identifies as a captain, the question is really, how could you not go down with your ship if you are Captain Smith?
Well, it was a pleasure as always getting to chat with you about boats and your very strong opinions related to the Titanic matters. Do you have any closing statements for the audience? Anything you might say to the people who are interested in the sport of observing boats?
Lose yourself in the history. Understand that it is a different era that you're exploring. Understand that it's gone, but understand that it was, in fact, a very unique time. And understand the causes behind that time. It was a deep mixture of economics, politics, culture that ended up creating this phenomenon on these ocean liners. So really explore the unique aspects of it that make it history.
What a fantastic chat.
Of course, pleasure as always.